Welcome to the Football Autobiography Show. I'm your host, Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for making this a part of your day. Before I go into today's show, I have some pretty big news for y'all. Starting in the beginning of January, I will be joining forces with TIFO, the website formerly known as UMaxit. The new show will have a new podcast feed, and all my episodes will be available on www.tifo.com. I'm really excited to work with Joe Devine and the whole crew at TIFO to make this show even better. The new show will be done the exact same way, with the same format, long-form interviews with guests, so you don't have to worry about that. It's the same show, just with a new name and new guests. Some of these new guests for the upcoming season, I'll give you a couple of the names just to tease it right now. Ron Atkinson, Adebayo Akinfenwa, Laurie McMenemy, and many, many more. I've already done 10 of the episodes, so I can promise you they'll be very, very good. I can say that unequivocally right now. I'll have more details about the new transition in the coming weeks, so stay tuned and check out my Twitter page or Facebook page for updates. If you have a suggestion for a new name for the show, send me a message on Twitter or go onto the Football Autobiography Show Facebook page and leave a message there. Now, moving on to today's show. Today's guest is Anthony Clavane. Clavane is the author of 4 books, including Promised Land, A Northern Love Story, which won the Football Book of the Year and the Sports Book of the Year in 2011. He is a teacher, and he writes on sport for the Sunday Mirror and contributes to other publications, including the New Statesman and the New European. His most recent book, A Yorkshire Tragedy, The Rise and Fall of a Sporting Powerhouse, was just re-released in paperback a couple weeks ago, and you can find it on Amazon or wherever you get books. You should go check that out. He is also a playwright and has written 2 plays called Playing the Joker and Leeds Lads. And as a Leedsman himself, Clavane joined me to discuss his book, Does Your Rabbi Know You're Here? The book is about the history of Jews and football and Jews in football. But what made it especially interesting to me is at its core, it's an immigrant's tale and takes on issues that are relevant, especially to today, which is immigration populations in the UK and, how they assimilate and how they become part of the culture. And one of the ways is, of course, through football. So this episode, is perfect for you if you are interested in Judaism and football or just immigration and football and the role football plays in society. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do as well. Without further ado, enjoy my chat with Anthony Clavane. I'm here with multiple-time author Anthony Clavane. Anthony, how you doing?
Hi, Josh.
You grew up Jewish. You grew up in love with football. Can you explain your relationship growing up with both of those in your life?
Well, actually, when I was young, my headmaster said to me, sounds like the beginning of a song, doesn't it? But he said to me and my fellow school friends at the Sally Brodetsky Jewish Day School in Leeds, he said, when you grow up, there are 3 things I don't want you to do. 1 is marry out. 2 is eat treif.
What's treif?
Non-kosher food.
Okay.
Do you not say treif in America?
No, we just say non-kosher.
Okay.
Yeah.
And thirdly, don't get involved in football. And on the first thing, I did marry out. On the second, I must confess that I had a bacon sandwich before I met you here at the British Library. And thirdly, yes, I am in love with football. So I kind of contravened the 3 commandments that Mr. Abrahamson gave. But I went to a Jewish school in Leeds. I was born and grew up in a Jewish community in Leeds. And although when you think about the Jewish community in this country, people always talk mainly about the London Jewish community. But there are 2 other very big Jewish communities, the Manchester one and the Leeds one. And my great-grandparents, many of them, I mean something like 4 or 5, they came from Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they fled from the pogroms. It's the usual story. They were refugees. So I was, third generation Leeds, and I was also, like all of my family, completely and utterly obsessed with football. But they sent me to a Jewish primary school, and we were discouraged from playing football. And because, you might sound odd, but football is played on a Saturday. That's when you should be at shul. You do say shul in America, don't you? Temple.
Typically, we say temple or
you
synagogue.
don't even say shul.
No, not typically.
It's
no.
terrible.
Yeah.
The synagogue on Saturday. You're not supposed to do any work. It's a day of rest. But also, as I detail in the book that we're going to talk about, there are about 4, 5, 6 other reasons why Jews have not historically got involved in football. And when I was told I can't get involved in football, when my school friends were told we can't play football, we decided even more we're going to not just get involved and play it, but we're going to be obsessed with it. And I really remember the obsession of all my friends, nearly everybody in our community, for Leeds United. And that story was a story I told in my first book, Promised Land.
And so you mentioned there are 5 or 6 reasons that Jews weren't encouraged to play football. You mentioned, not doing work on Saturday on the Sabbath. What are the others?
The other strong one, there are several, but the really strong one was that in the 1960s and 70s, Jews had become pretty much sort of integrated, not fully, into British society. So I have to look at this historically, because if we look at my great-grandparents and grandparents and even parents, there was a sense of alienation that they felt from British society, and they were encouraged to get involved in football. But by the time third-generation kids like me were growing up, it was felt by some of the Jewish leaders that integration had possibly gone too far. And that's where football came in, because if you played football, you'd end up playing with non-Jews, and you'd probably end up, I didn't play we did have a Jewish football league, but I didn't play in the Jewish football team. That's another story, actually, which I'm not entirely in agreement with the idea of Jewish-only football. But anyway, I played for a non-Jewish team, so I mixed with non-Jewish people, and it was all part of my assimilation. So integration is okay, but assimilation's not okay to Jewish leaders, because if you assimilate too much, you start to lose your Jewish identity, according to them, and you marry out, and you kind of are responsible for the reduction of the Jewish community. And to put it in its very extreme, bluntest, and rather distasteful form, you're doing Hitler's work, because you're kind of like leading to the reduction in the community. And in a sense, the idea that we should stick together in our ghettos, and we should, learn together, work together, play together, just marry within the community, was so strong when I was growing up. That I still feel it now when I go back to the Leeds Jewish community. I'm the only one, really, of my family or extended family who kind of moved away. 1 or 2 moved away and went back again. But I even feel that now. I feel a bit of an exile, and I'm still not sure, if it was the right thing. But the irony is, we were all obsessed with football, but we were, by the time of the 60s and 70s, we were being discouraged from it because there was a fear, almost a moral panic amongst the Jewish leadership, that it would lead to eventual diminution of the Jewish community, and we wouldn't have Jewish grandchildren, and it was all my fault for playing football.
And You start in the book. We're gonna go into the book. Does your rabbi know you're here? You start about when this really kind of Jews and football really started mixing in the end of the 19th century, when the second Tsarist in Russia.
Tsarist Alexander II was assassinated in, I think it was 1881.
Yeah, and then that started the exodus of Jews. I think you said 2 million in the book.
Yeah.
Throughout Europe, including, of course, to the UK. And I would just like if you could kind of just give a little bit more context as to what the environment was like that they were coming into, and because there were already several thousands of Jews already here.
Yeah. So there was already an established community, a very, very small one, in parts of the East End of London, parts of Leeds, parts of Manchester. But that was basically a community that had come over from Germany, from Central Europe, and that was also a community very tiny community, which had successfully assimilated to the point where, to give the biggest example of all, the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, although of Sephardi descent, he sort of typified that. Although his father converted to Christianity, he was actually Prime Minister. But I think the Jews who were here at the time, before the great influx from Eastern Europe, were a settled middle-class community, very assimilated and very resentful, in fact, of the hundreds of thousands of working-class, Yiddish-speaking, alien-looking oddballs who came over and didn't really want there to be this flood of immigration. And it was interesting that they were supporting attempts to curb this by the time of the 1905 Aliens Act, which Jews who were immigrants were called aliens. There are certain parallels, of course, with what's going on today. We could come on to that, but so there was opposition from the middle class, already established Jewish community. There was opposition from the kind of precursors of the sort of like Brexiteers of today, who wanted to close the borders and so on. And there was a kind of an influx of, a few 100,000 who came to Britain. Most of the 2 million from the Tsarist Russian Empire, and within that, it was Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on. But it was basically Tsarist Russia. Most of those went to the United States of America. The vast majority went to the United States of America. But a few 100,000 came to Britain. Most of those settled in the East End of London, around Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and a smaller number settled in Manchester's inner city area, and also in Leeds' inner city area. Now, those are the three main communities, the biggest one of which is London. They came to this country, there was no welfare state. They were living in ghettos. They were living in overcrowded areas which were, this kind of areas which you could call slums. And how did they get out of that? Well, the way to get out of the ghetto was, back then anyway, to kind of, fight your way out. I say they were getting attacks. There were actual anti-Semitic gangs and so on, but there was just hostility. In Leeds, for example, I remember my grandparents in their day, they were living in a ghetto called the Leylands. They were crammed into this very small space just outside the town centre, about 30,000 of them. And when they went out of the Leylands to look for jobs, there would be signs in factories saying no Jews required, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism there, which I sort of document in Promised Land, the book, and also Does Your Rabbi. So they had to fight their way out, they had to prove themselves, and this is where sport comes in. This is where football comes in. if you fight yourself out your way out of a community, and it's the same with black boxers, for example, today, and well, for generations, you actually literally fight your way out. You're using your fists. You're defending yourself from attacks. There was an infamous pogrom or mini pogrom against the Jews of Leeds in 1917, I think, in which there were big attacks from mainly Irish gangs coming down from the bank to attack the Jewish ghetto. And to fight back, you had to quite literally, organise. Often they would organise in trade unions, Jewish trade unions. There were a lot of Jewish boxers in Leeds, in Manchester and in London. A lot of Jewish boxers in America as well. I mean, it's quite a common trope to see that. But another way of fighting your way out of the ghetto was to prove yourself in the game of the national game of England, which was football. And in those early days, in the early 20th century, Jewish leaders, this is contrasting to when I was growing up 50, 60 years later, were encouraging Jewish boys to play football because they could win acceptance, they could have a sense of belonging, they could prove that they weren't alien, that they were playing the English game, and that they were good at football, and that they were good at boxing, they were good at rugby, they were good at cricket. It was definitely a way of integrating into society. And just as, say, in the United States of America, baseball was used as a way of integrating Jews into American society, association football performed the same function in this country. And thousands upon thousands of Jewish boys, and it was mainly boys, were taught to play football, played football, and ended up going into football teams. And quite a few of them ended up playing at a very high level.
You mentioned the first one in the book, which is a great story. He was actually Irish.
Yeah.
I'm blanking on his first name, but Bookman.
Louie Bookman.
Louie Bookman, who has an absolutely incredible tale, and he represented Ireland at the national level. And
yeah, amazing. Nobody knew about him, I mean, a few people knew about him. This is one of the, before we talk about him, he's not celebrated in the same way that, so someone like, Viv Anderson, quite rightly, is celebrated, as the first, I think, black player to play for England. I mean, there's a lot of very important work being done about, particularly, black players and the obstacles they had to overcome, the racism and the great heroism of so many of the early black players. And there's a lot of work which, I think still needs to be done on that. But nobody had really thought about this, and nobody had really thought about Louie Bookman. But he, as you say, I mean, he was an Irish-Lithuanian Jew.
What a combination.
Quite a combination. And luckily I managed to talk to his daughter, who's 80, and she told me all about his story, but I also began to piece together his story by going to museums, reading one or two books, going to libraries, but his daughter and her husband showed me all the medals that he won, showed me all the newspaper cuttings, which were very interesting. And I mean, this was, to me, very exciting. I mean, the reason why we do these things, it's not just to, write and tell a story that's never been told. The excitement of that research, you're kind of coming across new research in a way. If she hadn't brought out her scrapbook of her father's great sort of exploits in the First Division, which, was the Premier League, was then the First Division, and if she hadn't shown me all of that and shown me his medals, his caps, then I mean I wouldn't have known, and I don't think a wider public would have known. So Louie Bookman was a true pioneer.
Well, it's something that that story brings to light for me when I read it was, so Louie Bookman, I mean, he's not really well known or well celebrated because also he didn't really embrace his Jewishness or his Jewish identity, and at the time it was very common for people to downplay it. So can you explain what first of all, why players like that wanted to downplay it? I mean, and not just him. I mean, thereafter, plenty of other, like
Well,
David Pleat and plenty
yeah,
others.
I mean, you
that-
could go through nearly everyone who was involved in English football or British football until perhaps I'd say the 80s, the 1980s. I mean, you could probably say there's 80 years in which Jews were hidden from football. They were like the invisible men. They were like I've called them the forgotten tribe of British football. And one of the reasons that they were hidden and they were invisible and they were forgotten is that they, unlike today, which is only right, they weren't recognised as a minority struggling against really a system that was in many ways discriminating against them. Let's not pull any punches about that. There was a lot of discrimination. So the authorities wouldn't particularly recognise them as being Jewish for various reasons. Some of them anti-Semitic, but just others simply no sense of the issues of diversity, which are embraced today, were not embraced back in the 20th century. But the other reason is that Jews themselves were not embracing their own difference, their otherness. Why were they doing that? I mean, first of all, for survival. I mean, as somebody once said to me, a friend of mine, a black friend of mine said to me, he said, you can pass, it's all right for you, you can pass. In other words, I could go through my life and people wouldn't have to know I'm Jewish, Yeah. I'm white, I don't believe that, in the stereotype about, there are Jewish, mannerisms and so on. I think, one or two perhaps, yeah. But on
in
the
a
whole,
lineup that you couldn't get pointed out as, that's the Jew necessarily.
Well, that's right. And you mentioned David Pleat. He was a very successful manager for Tottenham. First of all, for Luton, by the way, he did great work for Luton. Got them into the top flight and played a load of black players when people weren't playing them. David Pleat is still very respected in the game. But when I wrote about him and when I talked about him, and this is a lot of Jewish people, there was almost disbelief. What? He's Jewish? I didn't know. Nobody knew. He never said. Part of me is thinking, well, does it matter? Who cares? And in fact, it's good that we just get to a phase when it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or non-Jewish, white or black, whatever, gay or heterosexual. It doesn't matter. But in a way, it does matter because, David Pleat's story, just like Louie Bookman's story and Les Goldberg's story, and all the stories, Harry Morris's story, Mark Lazarus's story, they're all pretty much the same. And that's someone who is brought up in a very, Jewish background, might not be religiously very Jewish, but culturally very Jewish, steeped in the values, sensibilities, and I don't know, the kind of, the ethos of what it means to be in a minority Jewish community. And then they're suddenly propelled into the limelight, and they become, stars of our national game. And what happens then? Do they come out or do they not? And the parallel here for me is quite clear. We don't have any gay players who are out at the moment in English football. In the past, when they have come out, the likes of Fashanu, their story has ended very tragically. One or two players have started to come out after they've left football. Hitzelberger, for example.
Yeah, and Robbie Rogers
who played for Leeds. But he didn't come out when he was at Leeds, but when he came back to Ellen Road after he left, he got a standing ovation. But the point is, the question you're asking me is why didn't these people, be open and honest about their Jewishness? It's the same question as why are gay football players not being open and honest about their homosexuality?
Yeah. And so so obviously, since, we're talking about in the 60s and the 70s with Pleat and other people, and they, kind of kept that behind closed doors. But we've had several very prominent, openly Jewish players since
Sure.
those times. So what has changed? What was there a turning point that you noticed, or?
Well, I think I've divided the book into 3 parts, and I've called them 3 ages. And
so you have the golden age in the middle is what we
Yeah.
were talking about with David Pleat, and then we have the new age,
Yeah.
which is like in the post 80s.
Yeah. And in the golden age, which is the second one, I mean, the first age is a lot, basically Yiddish speaking, Jewish Russians are coming over, and their children are struggling, but they're trying to fight their way out of the ghetto, and they're trying to prove themselves. First generation, yeah. And that kind of goes up to like the 1940s, 50s. And then I think there's a golden age. What I mean by that is suddenly you do get a lot of Jewish players. They're not necessarily openly Jewish, but they're Jewish players. There are also a lot of Jewish fans. There are a lot of Jewish writers in football. There are beginning to be Jewish administrators, owners, chairmen. And again, it's not that they're standing up saying, I'm Jewish, but they are there, and there are very Jewish clubs like Leyton Orient. I mean, Charlton was a little bit, but what I meant to say, Leyton Orient was a very Jewish club. Leeds United was a very Jewish club. Arsenal was a very Jewish club. I'm not saying the obvious one here, by the way, and that's another issue that I'd like to come on to.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to bring up next. Yeah.
So this is a symptom, I think, of the problematic way in which we discuss this whole issue. People only think about Tottenham. But at the same time, of course, Tottenham had a very big Jewish community. When I talk about the Golden Age, that's really when, that was a double-edged sword, the Golden Age, because, there was a report in The Guardian that estimated, I don't know how they counted this, but they said a third of the 30,000 people at White Hart Lane were Jewish. This is a Guardian report. And again, I think we'll come on to that in a minute. My point is, the reason it's double-edged is that then in the 60s, 70s, it suddenly it was Tottenham are the Jewish club, and they attracted a lot of hostility, a lot of anti-Semitism. Alf Garnett was a very popular sitcom figure in something called Till Death Us Do Part.
Yeah.
And he was and it really was one of the most popular programs in Britain. And, when you think about it, you might have had between 15 and 20 million people watching. Astonishing reach. Harold Wilson, when he was Labour Prime Minister, was worried that, if they held I think it was the 1966 election on the same day of Till Death Us Do Part, the Labour's vote would go down, because basically the working class vote, they wouldn't be bothering to come out, they'd be watching Alf Garnett. But the point about Alf Garnett is he was a bigoted West Ham fan. And he started to talk about Tottenham as the Jews, the Yids, and he would always make reference to that in a derogatory way. And I think the equivalent in the States is Archie. I've forgotten his surname.
Bunker.
Yeah.
Archie Bunker.
Archie, that's right.
Yeah.
He was based on Alf Garnett.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to be laughing at him, but some people started laughing with him.
Yeah.
And that idea of Tottenham as the Yids, which I don't like, and again I think we should come on to talk about that. That was a derogatory term, but anyway, that grew, and then you had a lot of football clubs, doing terrible things in their chants when they, whether it was hissing to do with concentration camps or the gas chambers, or whether it was, simple anti-Semitic verbal abuse and also attacks. That was a kind of a golden age, in the sense of it was a moment of sort of liberation for Jews in football, but it was also because of that, you put your head above the parapet and you're a target. David Pleat came out of that golden age, and I think the reason he kept quiet, who can blame him in some ways, is that he didn't want to be discriminated against, I feel. So that's why it wasn't known that he was Jewish, but it was also not known that, as I say, with this whole range of footballers, it wasn't known that they were Jewish. But then we came on to the new age, and when did it change? I think it changed in the 1990s. And I think it changed because of the way that football changed in the 1990s. And I think that football moved out of its ghetto. It moved away from what had been the horrors of the 1980s, not just hooliganism, but racism. In the 1980s you had Heysel. You also had terrible disasters at football matches where fans were treated really badly. Hillsborough's a very, obvious example of that. You had sort of a terrible moment in the 1980s when it felt like, if you were black, you really shouldn't go to a football match because you were a target. Black players had bananas thrown at them.
And you still didn't really have any foreign players.
And you didn't have any foreign players.
You had a couple, but and really not many. I remember the statistic you had in the book. It was, staggering how few foreign players were, and obviously with the new Premier League that brought in a lot of money and a lot of foreign players.
So exactly. So that you've pinpointed it. The new Premier League, it became more cosmopolitan. Loads of nationalities. You look at today's Premier League. Perhaps it's gone too far the other way, but there are so many nationalities that it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, because as a couple of Jewish players said to me, when they're in the changing room, it's part of the banter, because people go on about Jewish this, Jewish that. It's just what they do, but they have banter with all the other 10 or 11 nationalities about their nationality. So you're not different because you're Jewish. It's just like everyone's different now.
Yeah.
And that was a huge factor in making it a lot more acceptable, not for Jews to be involved and play, but to be open and honest about it. And that openness and honesty has only really emerged in the last 2 decades.
And I want to jump back to Tottenham. There's several points to hit here, but one of the first things that I noticed while reading the book was that, you said the location for most of the Jews were the East End originally.
Yeah.
So we're talking like Bethnal Green. For people that know London, and Whitechapel, which is traditionally East End, and which is closer to West Ham.
Sure.
Without a doubt, it struck me as to why. Yeah. There were so many of those fans were actually Tottenham fans. So if you could just kind of explain first, before we get into other Tottenham-related stuff, why that's the case.
Again, I just want to reference Alf Garnett again, Until Death Us Do Part. This is the irony of this is fascinating. So you've got I'm saying Archie Bunker because I'm presuming you'll know a lot more about Archie Bunker.
Most of the audience is British anyway, so we can stay along the British lines here.
Okay. So you've got this, bigoted West Ham fan, and he's going on about. Obviously he's going on about the blacks in very unpleasant terms. He's going on about Asians. He's going on about, homosexuals. He's going on about anyone on the left. Basically, the guy who wrote it was Johnny Spate, who was this kind of working class socialist, anti-racist, who wanted to expose, and he chose a kind of West Ham fan. Apologies to all those West Ham fans out there, because there is also a Jewish tradition at West Ham we'll come on to in a minute, and they have actually got, one of their owners is in fact Jewish, David Gold, and he's got an interesting story that I talk about in the book. Anyway, Tottenham. Alf Garnett is played by Warren Mitchell. Warren Mitchell is himself a Jewish Tottenham obsessive. He's a very famous actor. So here he was sending up the West Ham bigot. Now I think that's quite kind of interesting, because I think that goes back to the early 20th century. The vast majority of Jews in London were living in the East End, and therefore West Ham would seem to be their natural home. Why wasn't it? You've got 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, West Ham at the time is very much based around the sort of ironworks that the reason they're called the Irons is because they are a club that is linked to the local factory, and in that factory let's put it like this: you wouldn't get many Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, there were tailors in the East End. They were market traders in the East End, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier in Leeds as well. It just wasn't acceptable for Jews to go into factories and to work in factories unless they were owned by other Jews, and they would employ them. And I think there was a lot of discrimination. I'm not saying that West Ham as a club discriminated. I'm just saying it was a link. Just to say in Sheffield, you've got a link with the steel factories.
The unions and the club.
Yeah, the unions, the club, but just the culture of, like the mines in Barnsley being linked to Barnsley Football Club. But you don't have many Jewish miners, so you didn't have many Jewish Barnsley players, Or, you get the mills in Bradford. The mills in Bradford, again, Jews didn't work. My parents and my family worked in the markets in Bradford. They didn't work in the mills. So very often you get the industrial working classes being linked to a football club, and that's how English football develops. And that was its strength up until the last 20 or 30 years before all that industry went, the mines, the steel, the mills, and so on, and the fishing industry in Hull. So basically, without accusing, I'm not going to accuse West Ham of this because I don't think it did happen, but it was just Jews didn't have a culture that linked them to their local football club. So they didn't feel, what I heard and what I read was that they didn't feel at home when they went to Upton Park. Secondly, it was very easy to go to North London to watch Tottenham if you lived in the East End of London, because there'd be a tram, and today there is a train which takes you on the same route. And in fact, I've just come from Liverpool Street today, but which kind of serves the the East End. Just as back then they got on a tram and later a train, it would take 20 minutes to get to White Hart Lane. So if you go by tram or train to North London, I mean, it's just the same amount of time as it would take to go to, say, to walk to Upton Park. But the third reason is that, and this was a really big factor in the first generation not supporting, but the second generation supporting football. The Saturday thing is that you don't go to a football match on a Saturday. You don't work on a Saturday. You don't use money on a Saturday. That is part of the sort of religious injunction of being a Jew. It's a day of rest. It's not the day of going to a football match. And the first generation would stick to that religiously, so to speak. The second generation, who were definitely being watched over by the first, I mean, they had to sometimes sneak out of the house to play football or to watch football, but they still thought they could get round it, because if you could get on a tram or a train with and go to the football match and you hadn't paid money, you got your ticket in advance, or you got your ticket for the game or whatever, you could actually get round it by not exchanging money on the day. And you would, you go to White Hart Lane, and there was also a very, and this is where the sort of disputatiousness of Judaism comes in. There was a very interesting loophole in that something about combustion engines. If the mode of transport had a combustion engine and you rode on that mode of transport on a Saturday, you weren't technically, according to some Jewish scholars, breaking the Sabbath, the Shabbat. And it sounds odd, but this was a loophole which allowed large numbers of Jews to go to Tottenham. Later, 10, 20, 30 years later, they'd actually moved north to Golders Green. They'd moved north to where White Hart Lane, and today you can see, obviously, there is a big, very Orthodox community around White Hart Lane. The Jews are now established and have been for about 80 or 90 years in North London and beyond. But back then, that cemented their relationship with Tottenham. But right at the beginning, they would contravene the very strictest of religious orthodoxy to go to White Hart Lane. And there are a few other reasons why this happened, but I'll just pick one out because I don't want to sort of give every reason. I want people to read the book and find out.
Yeah.
But Tottenham was suddenly a kind of glamorous club. They won the FA Cup in the early 20s, and there's no doubt about it. I'm not saying that we Jews are glory hunters, but if you were a Jewish community obsessed with football, wanting a team to support, and back in the early 20s, you think, which is the London team to support? Is it the one up the road, West Ham, or is it the team that's won the FA Cup, which is very glamorous, which is suddenly becoming a big name? Tottenham for a long time weren't. I mean, they were overshadowed by Arsenal, but they were beginning to be a big name. It was very much an attachment based on the team that you go to the cinema and you see in the newsreels, Tottenham Hotspur. They are the glamorous team in London. They won the FA Cup, and even now today, I mean, they have that glamour about them. Tottenham. This might be the most controversial thing I've said in this podcast, but in my mind, they're a lot more glamorous, than West Ham United.
I would say without a doubt.
Are you a Tottenham fan?
No, I'm not.
Right.
I'm a Liverpool fan. But
but you know what I mean.
I know. I follow what you mean. But something else that's very interesting is, obviously, Jews had a strong connection with not just Tottenham but with Arsenal. And in the book, you kind of detail how actually the track record of Jewish treatment of fans at Tottenham was not as good as Arsenal, which is not something you would expect for what's considered the Jewish club.
Well, this is why earlier I was alluding to the fact that there's this myth about Tottenham being a Jewish club and the Jewish club, and therefore it's for many reasons it's odd that they should be called by that Y word, which I hope we do talk about, because I have a few things to say about that.
Yeah, well, right now, no time like the present.
Well, but just on the Arsenal thing, Arsenal fans and in the past, and now, in fact, Chelsea and West Ham occasionally, they do verbally abuse or certainly used to verbally abuse Tottenham in derogatory anti-Semitic ways. The irony being that Arsenal, in my mind, had more claims to be called a Jewish club, when we're getting into the 80s and 90s, than Tottenham. And Arsenal treated their Jewish supporters, who, let's face it, by the time Jews are living en masse in North London, they're more or less divided, between Arsenal and Tottenham, and it's pretty 50-50, in a way, it's a bit like, in Glasgow Rangers or Celtic, although there is a religious divide there, between the Protestant and the Catholic. I'm not comparing it, although I remember once when I went to Glasgow and I was stopped by some football fans, and they, I think they were Rangers, and they were going, what are you? Are you Protestant or Catholic? And I didn't know what to say, so I just said, well,
Jewish.
I'm Jewish. They said, yeah, well, are you Protestant Jewish or Catholic Jewish? And that was kind of in North London. Are you Arsenal Jewish or are you Tottenham Jewish? And obviously big rivalry. But Arsenal treated their Jewish fans. Herbert Chapman, the most famous manager in Arsenal's history, more famous than Arsene Wenger, George Graham, Bertie Mee, whoever you like to mention. His team went on to win, 3 titles. He tragically died in the 30s before the 3rd title was won. So Herbert Chapman, and there's a marble statue to him, of course, in the I was going to say in Highbury, in the
Emirates.
In the Emirates. He was known as a friend of the Jews. If you read his obituary, or his obituaries, so many people say that he did a lot of work with the Jewish community, Jewish charities. He was an honorary Jew in a sense. He wasn't Jewish, but he was seen as being very friendly to Jewish people, very supportive of the community. So that's the 30s. But by the time of the 1960s, when there's a Jewish holiday, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Arsenal are putting out in their programme, whole page ads saying we'd just like to wish our Jewish fans, happy holidays.
And didn't they move the kickoff for one of the games?
More importantly, they even moved the kickoff from one of the games. This is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, against, I think it was Northampton.
Exactly, against it wasn't a huge match, but it was against Northampton, and they moved it because it clashed with, I think it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So that was interesting. The reason they did that, I mean, not simply because Arsenal were very, well, they were pro-Jewish, but it wasn't that they were just like sympathetic to minority groups. It was self-interest because a large number of their fans wouldn't be able to go to the match. So it just shows you how many Arsenal fans were Jewish, that they moved the game. But Tottenham didn't do that. And in fact, up until the 1980s, Tottenham, the board, were not welcoming to Jews. So I'm not going to, again, like with West Ham, I don't want to go down the route of saying, anything more than that. But let's just put it this way. If, as The Guardian estimated, a third of Tottenham fans who went to matches were Jews, and that's like 10,000 out of 30,000. If, as we know, they had enormous fan base, and also, as I've mentioned in the book, they had several Jewish players, you would then expect Tottenham to do what Arsenal did and be as welcoming as possible to their Jewish supporters. So, for example, by the time of the 1960s and 70s, and you can look at one of the best books ever written about football is Hunter Davis's book, The Glory Game. If you haven't read that, I recommend it. And by the way, you should get Hunter Davis on a podcast.
I've been talking with him to get him on.
What a great book that is, and it's very interesting because it looks at the Jewish businessmen who are beginning to follow Spurs around, and the super fan Maurice Keston, who I talk about in the book, who was Mr. Tottenham. He's an incredible figure, and you've also got these like characters like One-Armed Lou, who I talk about in the book. These sort of semi-gangsterish characters who are like out of a Damon Runyon novel. But you have got this fantastic sort of Jewish support for Tottenham, and yet, despite the number of businessmen who were there, none of them were encouraged or invited to invest in the club. And in fact, the board, up until Irving Scholar in 1982, didn't have a Jewish person on it. And that's surprising because you take my own club, Leeds United, in the 1960s, 3 out of 6 of the Leeds United board were Jews. Manny Cousins, Sidney Simon, and I'm going to say Alf Roberts, but I've forgotten his first name. But basically, and then you had Leslie Silver as well, who was chairman of Leeds when they won the title. But Irving Scholar was the first Jew to be on the board, and he became, chairman of Tottenham. And since Irving Scholar in the 1980s, there have been a succession of Jewish owners.
Well, I wanted to talk about that. You in the book mentioned kind of the commercialization of football was in large part due to the several of these Jewish owners that you mentioned. Yeah. Irving Scholar, you mentioned
David
Dean, and then one other. I'm blanking on. Oh my God.
Well, I mean, those were the two main ones, Irving Scholar and David Dean. But you also had a similar type of self-made Jewish entrepreneur, and this is the other thing. What changed was that self-made Jewish entrepreneurs were emerging in the 70s and 80s, and they were getting involved in football and entertainment and politics. It's no coincidence. I mean, I might disagree with Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, but for the first time in the 1980s, you had quite a few Jewish businessmen involved. In fact, Harold Macmillan was very sniffy about that, and he said the cabinet seems to have more old Estonians than old Etonians. So you've got quite a few who were involved. So it was a similar era. Alan Sugar is obviously someone who comes to mind.
That's the other person
that's
I was
the other
thinking
one.
of. Yeah.
And you can just go through quite a few, and David Bernstein at Manchester City, Leslie Silver at Leeds United. They were a generation, who'd come from nowhere. Often they were born into humble, modest circumstances, but they had become very successful businessmen, and the doors were opening for them. I mean, the doors weren't opening for their predecessors, and there weren't that many of them in the previous 50, 60, 70 years for reasons I've talked about. So we were having a more open, diverse society, and people like Irving Scholar and David Dean were instrumental in the formation of the Premier League, which basically changed football. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And again, this could be for better or for worse. But let's just recognise the fact that the Premier League did change football. Not just in this country, but around the world. So, how did all this happen? I mean, David Dean has told the story many times. Irving Scholar, isn't as forthcoming about it. But the creation of a breakaway league at the top of the football league was possible because of Dean and Scholar, Martin Edwards of Manchester United, and one or two of the other big clubs at the time, Everton, Liverpool and so on. They all got together. But there's also people like Alex Finn, who was Saatchi at Saatchi and then came to work for the FA, and he designed the blueprint for the Premier League. He was hugely influential in the creation of the Premier League as well. And why is it important? I mean, in some ways you think, well, does it matter? Of course it doesn't. But I think why it is important is that Jews had felt themselves to be outsiders, and they had felt to some degree excluded. I mean, people who came through at Tottenham had felt excluded for so long, and when you've got that kind of energy, the determination to prove the people who are excluding you wrong, the desire to prove yourself, that is a big motivation in sport and in business. And I think that explains, so many things about why, underdogs do well in sport. This is a whole other area of discussion, but it's very interesting, isn't it? You think, why do tennis players who are from, I don't know, Croatia or somewhere, why are they beating American tennis players? And very often, and this is very much true of the early Jewish boxers, early Jewish footballers, it's this sense of struggling through adversity, wanting to prove yourself. And I think that informed these businessmen. I mean, Alan Sugar, if you read his autobiography, and of course if you watch The Apprentice, he often refers to this. I mean, he had a really tough background. He really was up against a lot of obstacles, some of which were anti-Semitic. I mean, he's mentioned in his book. David Gold at West Ham has also talked about that, the anti-Semitism they faced. David Dean hasn't really talked about it, but I talked to people in his family who've said that certainly happened. So it's this outsider energy that kind of triggered, I think, a breakthrough in English football and a breakaway in English football. Where did all that sort of obsession, this zeal to transform society, to transform football come from? And I think the administrators of football who emerged, whether they're owners, chairmen, directors, various officials in the 80s and 90s, nearly all of them to a man, again, they all were men, so, I'm sorry, I'm not being sexist, but they all were men. All of them to a man had come from these kind of backgrounds. Their grandparents or parents had been, struggling in their communities, had, made ends meet just about, had often, one or two of them anyway, had, fought off anti-Semitism. I mean, Leslie Silver at Leeds United, he was the owner when Leeds won the league. the first division just the year before it became the Premier League. And he was someone who fought against fascism all his life. So they all come from similar backgrounds, that generation. So that's why I wanted in the final bit of the book to celebrate the new age, a new breed. David Bernstein was chairman of the FA. His name, obviously Jewish. He was not being, in the same way that others before him had been. He was not being reticent about his Jewishness. He was proud of his Jewishness. In fact, there's a great story about him on the day of his bar mitzvah, and I think it was 1956, wanting to leave his bar mitzvah early to go and watch his club Manchester City in the FA Cup final. They all have got this kind of story. David Bernstein, Irving Scholar, David Dean, Leslie Silver, Alan Sugar, David Gold, this new breed. And that new breed, I'm not saying single-handedly created this Premier League or changed football. Obviously not. There were about 10 different forces, but it was one of the forces that brought about the Premier League.
Yeah, and then you kind of finish the book talking about Roman Abramovich, who is, for maybe many people don't know, is Jewish and very proud of it. I want to tie this all back into something even bigger picture that we kind of discussed before we even came on, and how this book, when I was reading it, it struck me as more of an immigrant's tale. And of course, right now we're in a very important time in history, although I guess all time is important, but revolving around immigration in the UK specifically, but also in the States and elsewhere. And it struck me, if you just inserted Muslim or Afro-Caribbean or Asian instead of Jew in this book, you might have a similar tale to tell. And I was curious what similarities and also differences you could look at for from Jews in the 1960s or late 19th century to these groups that I just mentioned today or in recent times.
I'm so glad you've mentioned that, because up until now, and this was one of the real motives of writing this book. Yeah, I am Jewish and I'm interested in Jewish culture, and I'm not a religious Jew, but I'm very interested in the things that have formed me. My other books are about, northernness or Yorkshireness and being from Leeds. Those are all things which, I'm interested in because they've helped to form me in my views. But I've also wondered, how those things have affected the sport I love, football. And I really think that it is interchangeable, because you could write a similar book about the Muslim community, or if you like, the Asian sort of immigration that took place in the 60s, or indeed the Afro-Caribbean immigration that sort of started with the Windrush generation after the Second World War. You could tell the same story about that. You could actually tell the same story as well about, I think Catholics. I think that's quite an interesting one. But what we're looking at here is a minority who is discriminated against in the beginning when it sort of emigrates to this country. And these early immigrants are, in all these three that we're talking about, whether it's Afro-Caribbean, Asian or Jewish, they're all kind of struggling with the same kind of things. Externally, discrimination. Internally, a sense of not wanting to lose their own identity. So just like my headmaster saying, don't play football, don't marry out, and so on. The same thing happens with, those other immigrant communities. The reason is if you kind of integrate too much, if you assimilate, and then you will lose your identity. So there are those pressures, both externally and internally, and also ultimately becoming a kind of a success story. And what I mean by that is, I think, I cover 150 years in the book, Does Your Rabbi Know You're Here? And I've divided it up into 3 ages, but basically it's a positive story about how an immigrant community that was branded as being alien, literally because they passed an act called the Aliens Act, branded as an alien force that would, damage the fabric of British life, and all these arguments that we are very familiar with today when we talk about refugees. They, over a course of 100 to 150 years, have become accepted as integral to society, and football is a good way of showing that. So the people who were the outsiders are now the insiders. So the people who were at once being attacked, when they were playing football, who were, prevented from playing football, kept out of, golf clubs, and we haven't even talked about that, but, that was a very common thing up until the 70s for golf clubs not to allow Jews, for example. They are now running the clubs. They're insiders and they're in control. So, David Tretman was the FA chairman before David Bernstein. Many of the leading clubs, you look at the top 6, Roman Abramovich at Chelsea, Daniel Levy at Spurs and so on, have, Jewish owners, Arsenal until recently. So I wanted to celebrate a very positive story that has happened over a long course of time. It's taken a long time, but I can see similarities, see parallels with what's happening with the Asian community, Afro-Caribbean. I just go to Leeds, for example, and I see that, where my grandparents and great-grandparents used to live in the poorer areas of Leeds, around the city centre in Chapeltown, they've moved literally up. They've gone up the hill to where they are, Moortown or Woodley, Shadwell. And that similar journey is being, is obvious to me, is happening for the Asian community as well. So, today, the obstacles that we faced, and basically this is going back to the late 19th, early 20th century, are not always being overcome. It takes time, and that's the thing. The immigration that we're talking about with reference to the Asian population and the Afro-Caribbean population is something that basically has happened since the Second World War, and in a way, they are yet to have their golden age. They are yet to have their new age, and I think with taking away the idea of the religious Jew, the cultural Jew, the political Jew, and all these issues that Jewishness is often talked about in connection with. For example, I didn't want to talk in this book about things like Zionism, or things like the Holocaust, or things like even anti-Semitism too much. Didn't really want to talk about that. I just wanted to say, what is it like for an immigrant, and it could be a Jewish immigrant, an Asian immigrant, black immigrant, Muslim immigrant, Syrian. What is it like when you come into a country and you have a problem which is twofold? First of all, you're not fully accepted by society. There's prejudice, discrimination, bigotry. And second of all, within your own community, because you are under siege, there is this pressure to stick in your ghetto and not leave your ghetto. And these are incredible pressures which were faced by my grandparents, great-grandparents, to a certain extent maybe my parents. I, as third generation, haven't faced them, and I feel I'm very lucky. I've benefited from the struggles that they went through, and the journey that they went through, and I'm, a beneficiary of 100 years of sort of struggle. And I don't feel today, I'm not minimising anti-Semitism, I'm not minimising the problems at which certain Jewish communities are facing, but I have never really felt in football an outsider, and I've been open about being Jewish. I've made no bones about it. I mean, obviously, the clue is in the title, Does Your Rabbi Know You're Here? I mean, it's clear that I am Jewish. And I haven't felt uncomfortable. And that's partly because, everyone's, as we said earlier, a different ethnicity or a nationality or a race or diversity is the norm now. But I wanted to look back at how my parents, grandparents and great-grandparents coped with a different set of problems, how they overcame those problems. And at the end of the day, it's a positive story, it's a success story, and it shows that immigration is not just something which can become accepted, but it can shape a society, can change society, transform it for the better. I mean, football is just one example of how Jewish immigrants have been involved in changing a huge national institution. You can say the same in cinema, in the theatre, in literature, in education, in science. You go through all these areas of life, and I don't just mean because they're Jewish, but because they've been immigrants, and the impact of immigrants on British culture was enriched, and it continues to be enriched. The culture is enriched by the involvement and participation of so-called outsiders, and it's a kind of parallel with today in the Brexit debate, where there's so much kind of, in my view anyway, prejudice, bigotry, often racism that enters the discourse about Brexit. And, the value to Britain of immigrant outsiders is quite clear to me in this story of English football over the last 150 years.
Yeah, and you go into great length, and we, if you enjoyed this talk, even just a little bit, there's plenty more details and a lot more stories in the book. I mean, you follow in the book 11 different people in extreme depth, and so people, if you enjoyed this, go check out the book, Does Your Rabbi Know You're Here? And then also, of course, you've written a number of other books, most recently one that just actually got re-released and paperback.
It's changed its title. It's a bit confusing, but it's just out, called Moving the Goalposts, and it is about the 1980s when everything changed in sport, in football and cricket and rugby league. And it's kind of based in Yorkshire in the 1980s, but it's sort of showing how all these sports have changed in the last 30 years, and not necessarily for the better, but it's looking at another area of my life, Yorkshire, and looking at what's happened to Yorkshire, but it's also looking at what's happened to the whole of the country through the prism of 3 different sports.
Sounds fascinating. I'll definitely check that out. And it's been a pleasure talking to you on this podcast.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Acast, or any podcasting catching app. Want to learn more about the guests and go behind the scenes? Then go to my website, www.footballoutobiographyshow.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Also, if you like the show, or even if you hated it, leave a comment on either my Twitter page @FootballAutoBio or my Facebook page, The Football Autobiography Show. I welcome and would appreciate any feedback from you all. Thanks for listening. Take care.